Masechet Gittin Daf Dalid. We saw in the Mishnah the law that if a messenger brings a get from outside Israel into Israel to deliver it to the wife, he must say Befanai nichtab ubefanai nichtam. We saw two reasons for this. Rabbah says because outside of Israel, people are not always careful or knowledgeable that the get has to be written lishma for the sake of this particular woman. And therefore, by the messenger saying it was written in front of me, that certifies that it was in fact written for this particular woman. Rava, however, his student says, no, the reason is because we don't have witnesses. If the witnesses are far away, and if they need to ratify the document because someone comes and says the signatures may be forged, so if the witnesses are in a faraway land, then we will not be able to ratify it. Therefore, the messenger saying it was written in front of me and signed in front of me, I saw them sign it. That is a certification that the witnesses are in fact, the signatures are in fact good, and it's kind of a pre-certification. All right, now that we know those two opinions, we're going to work through the rest of the clauses in the Mishnah to see how they relate to each of these explanations. Tenan, Rabban Gamliel omer afa mevi min harekem umin hacheger. Rabbi Eliezer omer afilu mikefar ludim lelod. In the Mishnah, Rabban Gamliel says, not only if someone brings it from a different country into Israel, even if someone brings it from these cities, Rekem and Cheger, which are right on they're close to the border. They're within Israel, but very close to the border. Nevertheless, even though it's technically in the legal border of Israel, you still have to say it because they're very close to the border. And Rabbi Eliezer says, even from Kfar Ludim Lelod, first of all, these are close by, but Kfar Ludim is technically on the other side of the border, even though it's actually closer, further within the border of Israel than other cities. That's because the legal border is not always straight, right? And it can go in and then out. And so let's say it goes in closer to the west. And then there's some city in the middle that's kind of enclosed, surrounded by the border of Israel, but that city itself is technically outside the border, even though it's actually closer than other cities that are further away. Rabbi Eliezer says those also one would have to say this formula, even though they're pretty close by. Relatively, they're technically outside the borders. Amar Abaye, ba'ayarot semuchot Eretz Yisrael ubuvlaot betchum Eretz Yisrael askinan. Abaye explains, you see in Eretz Yisrael, they knew these cities and they knew exactly what the reference was. Abaye in Bavel has to explain the situation that these cities are either close to the border of Israel, or they are within they are swallowed within the border. In other words, they're actually outside the border, but they are surrounded by the border itself. Okay, V'amar Rabba bar bar Chana, L'didi chazi liyahu atra, v'avekimi bekobe lepumpedita. Rabba bar bar Chana says, I went and actually saw the place, that village of Ludim, and I saw it was pretty close by. He's comparing it to two places in Bavel, like Bekove to Pumpedita. It's a short distance, even though in that case it's technically on the other side of the border. Now, since we have these two opinions that these border cities, you do have to say the formula, that means that they are arguing with Tanakama, and Tanakama would not require some people, messenger from those border cities to say the formula. Do not have to say the formula according to Tanakama. So what's at the essence of their machloket? We're going to try now to see if the machloket between Tanakama and the minority opinions perhaps matches up with the machloket between Rabbah and Rava. Now, if it does match up, it's actually a problem because we don't want the Tanakama, the Mishnah, to be like only one Amorah, because then that Amorah would have the Tanakama on the side. The other Amorah would have only minority opinions on the side. We would like to assume that all Amoraim can explain the Mishnah, can explain the Tanakama, the basic majority halacha. Okay, but we're going to set it up as a question My lab hakami palge. The more sabad lefisha and biki in lishma v'hane gemide. Perhaps the Tanakama says that the reason why a messenger would have to say the formula is because people outside of Israel don't know that it has to be lishma. This is the opinion of Rabbah. However, these border cities, they are knowledgeable, right? They're close by. They're actually technically either within or close by Israel, and therefore they're as knowledgeable as anyone else in Israel. That has to be in lishma, and therefore the messenger does not have to say it. So you see, Tanakama is assuming the reasoning of Rabbah, whereas whereas the minority opinions of Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer, they are assuming the reason of Rava, that it's hard to get the witnesses here. And these people, the witnesses, are not frequent because people do not go from those border towns. If it's across the legal border, then, even though it's close by, they don't usually travel, or it's close to the border, so it's farther away. And people do not usually travel, and it will be harder to find those witnesses than if they're in a major city within Israel. And that's why the minority opinions require the messenger to say "B'fanai nichtab, b'fanai nichtam," even though they're technically near or even in Israel. So that's how we can explain. We can line up Tanakama with Rabbah and the minority opinions with Rava. And is this not about the very same controversy? And we say La Rabbah metres l'tameh, v'Rava metres l'tameh. Rabbah, in fact, can explain the Mishnah, all of the opinions of the Mishnah according to his opinion, and Rava also can explain all the opinions of the Mishnah according to his reasoning. Rabbah metres l'tameh dekula amal lefisha en beki'in lishma. V'hacha b'hakami palge. Rabbah can explain everything according to his opinion that says the messenger has to say it because people outside the land of Israel are not careful about writing the get for her sake. And here's the essence of the machloket in the Mishnah. Tanakama sabar hane kevan desmuchot migmar gemire. According to Tanakama, because these people are nearby, they're still, even though they're on the border, they're near the border, but that's close enough. They're in Israel or near the border of Israel, and therefore they are knowledgeable, and so you said you don't have to say it. Rabban Gamliel says actually that's not true. The ones that are within the border of Israel are knowledgeable, so don't have to say it. Muvlaot, rather, the ones that are enclosed within the border. In other words, like if the border is a C shape, and the city is technically outside of it, so like Kfar Ludim, Rabban Gamliel would say Kfar Ludim is Muvlaot, and they're knowledgeable because they're very close by, even though they're on the other side of the border. Because they're very close by, they're knowledgeable and doesn't have to say it. But Rabban Gamliel says those cities that are near the border but at the edge and farther away, they are not knowledgeable. All has to do with distance, and that's why Rabban Gamliel adds in, for example, those two cities that are near the border and far away. They are not knowledgeable and therefore have to say the formula. And Rabbi Eliezer says even the ones that are close but technically on the other side of the border, like Kfar Ludim, they also are not knowledgeable, and that way you won't make a distinction between sections in Israel and outside of Israel. It's going to get confusing if you're going to say, well, it's outside the legal border, but it's pretty close. How about the next one? How close is that? So according to the Eliezer, it's much easier to make a law clear-cut. Anything that's not outside the legal borders of Israel, and if someone comes from there, you have to say the formula. Okay, so we explained the entire Mishnah according to Rabbah. Rabbah also metares leta'ameh dekula amal lefi she'en adi mesuyin lekayemo v'tana kama sabar hane kevan desmuchot mishkach shechiche. Rabbah says the entire Mishnah is assuming my reasoning that the witnesses won't be around to ratify it. So we want to pre-certify it by having the messenger say this formula. Now Tanakama says because these cities are nearby, so they will be found. And so so Tanakama says, right, they're all close enough within the border or close to. the land of Israel, and therefore there's no need to say the formula. Rabban Gamliel says if the city is close by, even though it's technically on the other side, it's easy to find those signatories, whereas the cities that are far away and all the way near the border, that it's harder to find, and therefore the messenger should say the formula in that case. Rabbi Eliezer says, even the ones that are close by, even though they are close by, and maybe it would be easy to find those witnesses, nevertheless, we should make the messenger say it, so that we don't have to make a distinction. La plug between those cities and faraway cities. So Rabbi Eliezer says, make the rule easy to follow. And just follow the legal border, even though the city might be over the border and closer and easier to get to those than a city that's farther away and inside the border. Nevertheless, it's easier to make a distinction in that way and require it in all cases, both when it's far away and even when it's close, but inside the border, but outside the border. And so we were able to explain the Mishnah according to all opinions. Next, Tanan. חכמים אומרים אינו צריך שיאמר בפני נכתב ופני נחתם אלא המביא ממדינת הים והמוליך. So the structure of the Mishnah was it brought Tanakama that says if you bring from outside in, then you have to say the formula. Then it brought those two minority opinions that we just discussed. And then it brings Chachamim that seems to repeat what the Tanakama said and says you only have to say if you're bringing, the messenger is bringing it into Israel from Medinat Hayam, but then adds the word v'hamolich, and also someone who takes it the other direction from Israel to Bavel, for example, or any other country, or Mitzrayim, any other country. So miklad Tanakama molich lo sarich. And so it sounds from this that there is a distinction between Tanakama and Chachamim, although they're very similar. And maybe you could read it, and we'll see in a second, someone will read it as a heading, right? This is the basic rule, and then there's subdivisions of clarifications of exactly when. But from here, it sounds like Tanakama is one opinion, and Chachamim are different. And according to Tanakama, if you go from Israel to outside, then you do not have to say the formula. According to Chachamim, that person would have to say the formula. So what would be the essence of their machloket? Maybe this argument is also about the same argument between Rabbah and Rava, that the Tanakama says the reason agrees with the reasoning of Rava, that people of Rabbah, that people are not familiar with writing it lishma. So in that case, if it's from outside to inside, the people outside of Israel don't know. That's where you have to say it. But if it's written in Israel and taken out, then you would not have to say it. That's the opinion of Tanakama. So Tanakama agrees with Rabbah that the reason is Levisha and Bikin Lishma, and these people in Israel are knowledgeable, so they don't have to say it. Umor Sabad, whereas Chachamim say Levisha and Edimisuyun Lekayimova Hanename La Shechiche. The Chachamim would agree with Rabbah that the reason is they're earlier, but they are assuming the reason that Rabbah later expresses that the reason why a messenger would have to say this when he comes from outside in is because the witnesses will not be available. That's true also if you're going from Israel to outside, between any country. It doesn't matter what direction, it'll be hard to find the witnesses. And therefore, you would have to say it in both directions, and that explains why Chachamim require it in both directions. And again here, this is a question, because we don't want Rabbah or Rava to have to side with only one of the opinions in the Mishnah. We'd like that they should each be able to explain the entire Mishnah. So, Rabbah Meteres Tama, Rabbah Meteres Tama. In fact, both Rabbah and Rava can explain the entire Mishnah according to their explanation. Rabbah Meteres Tama dekule amal lefish and bikin lishma. Rabbah says that the reasoning is because the people outside of Israel don't know, are not careful with the law of writing it for her sake. So what are they arguing about? whether we should make a gezerah of someone taking it out of Israel, because it might become mistaken with going into Israel. So since technically, really only if you bring it from outside to in, you would have to say the formula, because only outside of Israel they're not careful with lishma. However, if you require it in that case, but you don't require it when you go from in Israel to outside, then people will say, wait a second, that other get that I carried, let's say you have a guy who travels frequently, right? I carried that other get from Israel to outside, and I didn't have to say the formula, so I guess I don't have to say the formula either when I go from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. And it'll get confused and won't recognize the distinction between the cases. Therefore, make gezerah, you know what? We're going to require it in both directions. Tanakama sabar lo gazrin molicha tu mevi, v'Rabbanan batrae sabar sabre gazrin molicha tu mevi. So Tanakama says we don't have to make such a gezerah. People can figure out, oh yeah, you have to say it in this direction, but not in that direction. That's why Tanakama requires it only from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, but not the other way around. Whereas Chachamim say also someone who brings it the other way, because it'll get confusing. So that explains the entire Mishnah according to Rabbah. Now, Rabbah mitares leta'amed dekule alma levi she'en edim mesuyin lekayemo v'Rabbanan batrei lefarushe ta'amed Tanakama hu de'atu. So Rabbah also can explain the entire Mishnah according to his reasoning that we're not going to find the witnesses later on to ratify it. Rabbanan batra'eh. So the Chachamim and later part of the Mishnah are simply explaining what the Tanakama meant, and so since the reason is because we want to make sure that we want to ratify the witnesses. The witnesses won't be around. That applies in both directions. No matter what country, any other country, you're going to have a hard time finding the witnesses. So really, it applies in both directions, and Tanakama would agree with that. And so actually there's no machloka between Tanan and Chachamim, right? Even though we thought so before, because Chachamim add a word, but now we're explaining, no, Tanakama was just giving a heading, right? In general, when someone has to go from outside to Israel, you have to say this formula. And then there was two minority opinions about border cities, and then Chachamim say, oh, by the way, the other direction also. They're just expanding on, explaining the opinion of Tanakama. Tanakama was giving a shorthand as a heading, and the rest is commentary, which does in fact sound like the simple Peshat reading of the Mishnah. Good. Tanan, hamevi get medina b'midatayam tzarich lomar b'fanai nechtav u'b'fanai nechtab. So continuing, the next section of the Mishnah says that someone who brings a get from one region to another, one country to another country that are both overseas outside of Israel, has to say the formula. Now, since the Mishnah says that, what can we infer from that case? Right? What would be the opposite? What is it trying to exclude? We're going to see it could exclude a couple of different things, but so let's assume one way, and then we'll try the other way. So if it's saying from one country to another country overseas, you have to say it. It sounds like within one country, you would not need to say it, right? From one region in a country to another region in a country would not be necessary to say. Now, this, l'Rava nicha, l'Rava kashya. According to Rava, this makes sense. Since you're only going from one area to another area, but they're both in the same country, so travel is easy enough, and you'll be able to find the witnesses. It's only a problem if you're going from one country to another country overseas. So then you would have to ratify the signatures. But within the same country, that's fine. So this inference from the Mishnah makes sense. But according to Rabbah, both of these places are outside the land of Israel. So what does it matter if it's two different countries or it's two regions? It could be right down the block. And so you still should need to say it, because outside of Israel, they are not careful with writing it lishma. And so even if it's just on the other side of the village, you want to make sure that it was written lishma. And so you should have to say the formula. So the answer is, La temaha be'ota medina be'medinat hayam lo sarich, ela ema mimedina limedina be'eretz Yisrael lo sarich. Rather, don't have this the inference that you gave. I can give another inference from the Mishnah. Yeah, the Mishnah said that from one country to another country in Israel, you have to say the formula, and the inference, what it's coming to exclude is from one country to another country. One country to another country in Israel is not required. What does that mean, from one country to another country? During Roman times, Israel was split up into different regions, so that different administrative regions, and so they had a different governor that was in charge of it. So you can call that a Medina. And therefore, from, let's say, the north of Israel to the south of Israel was one Medina, and another Medina is not required. So that's what it's talking about, because, according to Rabbah, the whole reason is because people outside the land of Israel don't know about Lishma. But within Israel, they all know Lishma. So therefore, even if it's from all the way up north to all the way south of Israel, you don't have to say the formula, because you know that they're going to write it correctly. And so that's the inference that Rabbah can learn from the language of the Mishnah. We ask, we wouldn't need to learn that from an inference from this clause of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah actually says that explicitly. Said that if you bring a get within Israel, you don't have to say any formula. So, well, if we only had that line of the Mishnah, I might say that's b'di'avad. If you didn't say it, then b'di'avad it's okay, it's still a good get. But lichatechila, I wouldn't know that you need to say it at all. So kamash malan, that's why the inference from from this line of the Mishnah teaches us that not only b'di'avad is the get okay, even the chetechila you don't need to say the formula, because we're in Israel and everybody does it lishma. Okay, that's all one version of that line of reasoning, of that line of questioning. But we can also flip everything around and ask the question to Rabbah instead of Rabbah as follows: the Mishnah said that if someone goes from one country to another country that are all overseas, you have to say the formula. And our inference is that, therefore, from one country to another country in Israel, it's not necessary to say the formula. Now, with that inference, l'Rabbanicha, it makes sense for Rabbah, because it's all in Israel, and everybody knows the law that you have to write it lishma in Israel. That's why you don't have to say the formula. But according to Rabbah, if you're going from one state to another state within the borders of Israel, it will be hard to find the witnesses, and therefore you should say the formula. Why wouldn't you? And we answer, La tema mimedina lemedina be'eretz Yisrael lo sarich. So we answer, no, the inference that you made from the Mishnah is not so. We can have a different inference, and the Mishnah was coming to exclude a different case, which is going from one area to another area within the same country. That's what's not necessary, right? The Mishnah said if you take a get from one country to another country overseas, then you have to say it. And so we derive from that, it's excluding a case where it's one place to another within a country that is overseas. That's when you don't need, since it's within one country, so you can find the witnesses. Okay, so that answers the question. But that just raises a new question. Ava medina le medina. Israel, but what about bringing it from one country to another country within the land of Israel, right? The original inference. What would you say about that? Then you would require it? So if you would require it in such a case, because going from one country to another, then the Mishnah should have just said, from one country to another, you require it. And instead of, the Mishnah actually said, from one country to another country, only overseas. seas, then you require it. So why wouldn't you just say, leave out the words b'medinat hayam, if in fact you require it in all cases you're going from one country to another country, whether it's overseas or in Israel. So what are you going to say about that? And Rava answers, Le'olam mimedina lemedina be'et Yisrael nami la sarich dekevan de'ika ole regalim mishkach shechich. In fact, if you're going from one country to another within the borders of Israel, you don't need to say the formula. Why? Because you have people that are going to Yerushalayim for the Chagim. People are always traveling to Yerushalayim, and therefore even if they live way down south or way up north, and it's technically a different country because it's a different Roman province, that's okay, because people are traveling and crossing that border, and then you'll be able to find the witnesses. And so that's why within Israel, country to country, you don't have to say the formula. So that explains why the Mishnah said only country to country outside of Israel. It also explains why the Mishnah actually says explicitly within Israel, you don't have to say it at all. So that's how Rava can explain it. There is more travel within Israel because of Aliyah Laregel. Tenach bizman sheBeit HaMikdash kayam, bizman sheBeit HaMikdash kayam ma'ika lememad. That's fine when the Beit HaMikdash was standing, and people would come to the Beit HaMikdash for the holidays, and they would travel across borders. But when there's no more Beit HaMikdash, well, then what? Then you're going to say, oh, people don't travel so much, and then now you're going to start requiring it? And the answer is, even though there's no Beit HaMikdash, there are still standing courts that are fixed in these locations, and these are well-known, respected courts, and when people had to go to court, they would go to one of these courts. For example, one in Yerushalayim or Yavneh, right? These courts were in different places, and so if your local court couldn't handle a case that you had, so you would have to go to these courts, and people were still traveling. It's kind of fascinating that the Mishnah is using the Batei Din as a replacement for the Beit HaMikdash. This is done in other places also. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says we used to blow shofar only in the Mikdash on Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah, but now we do so any place where there is a Bet Din, right? The existence of a Bet Din is a stand-in, a replacement for the status of the Bet HaMikdash for a city. So that's a very significant way in which the rabbis allow continuity. We don't have Bet HaMikdash. We hope for one again. In the meantime, a Bet Din will take the place of certain things, of certain functions that the Bet HaMikdash used to have. After all, as we saw in the end of Masechet Sotah, the loss of the Bet HaMikdash, one of the major parts of that loss was the loss of the seat of the Sanhedrin. But that can partly continue in other major Batei Din. Okay, Tenan, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Afilu mehegmonia lehegmonia. V'amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Oir achat hayta be'eretz Yisrael, v'asisiyut shema, v'ayu ba shnei hegmoniot, shehayu makpidin ze al ze. Lefichach, husrichu lomar mehegmonia lehegmonia. Now, in the Mishnah says that according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, even from one district to another district, you do need to say the formula. And Rabbi Yitzchak, explaining, giving an example of Rashbag's case, says there was once one city called Asasiyut, and it had two districts within the same city, like East Berlin, West Berlin, right, are governed by was once upon a time governed by two different countries, and you couldn't even pass from one to the other, because each of the governors was particular and did not allow them to pass through from one side to the other. And that's why if someone it's hard to pass through, so the travel is not readily available. If someone does bring a get from one side to the other, one does need to say the formula. Okay, so that was being an example. There were in fact cities like this, because there were some cities that were kind of on the border between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, and so they would keep fighting back and forth, and that city in the middle might be actually split down the middle. This note explains in Roman times, the land of Israel was divided into three provinces: Palestina Prima, Palestina Segunda, and Palestina Tertia. This was after the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Romans, as an act of showing Judaism, they renamed the land of Israel into the ancient name Palestine. So this name is 2,000 years old and was meant to undo the sense of Jewish nationalism that was strong during Bar Kokhba revolt and caused the Romans a lot of pain. And so the Romans, as an act of propaganda, anti-Semitic propaganda, renamed it Palestine, and they happened to divide it into 3 different sections, so 3 provinces, each with its own military leader, governor. And so that's why they're called 3 different countries. And you may have a country, a city that's on a border. That would be half under this or half under that, or between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. And so there were cities like that, and you would have to say the formula. Now, let's talk about those cases. According to Rava, this makes sense, because it's difficult to pass, even though they're close by. I'm on this side of the wall, you're on that side of the wall, but it's going to be hard to get the witnesses to go and find them to ratify the document. And that's why we would need to say the formula. However, l'Rabba, kashya Rabba, this would be difficult because the city is within the national borders of Israel, the Jewish borders of Israel, and therefore everyone in both sides of the city know the halacha and are careful to write the get lishma. So why would you need it? And the answer is Rabba itle de Rava. Okay, there's a huge chidush that Rabba all along actually agrees with Rava's explanation, right? In other words, everyone agrees that one of the reasons that you have to, the messenger has to say the formula is because we may not find the witnesses in the future since they are far away or hard to get to. And therefore, the messenger acts as a kind of a notary, authenticating the signatures in the document. And that is, in fact, as we saw, the pshat of the Mishnah. The Mishnah makes reference to it directly. And so even Rabbah agrees that is a reason for it, except that Rabbah says there are 2 reasons to require it, and if either of them apply, then you're going to have to say it, whereas Rava says, no, there's only one reason for it, and therefore, if that one reason doesn't apply, you don't have to say it, even if it's coming from a place that is not lishma. So, Ela, my benayu. So now when we go back, remember we had a list of 3 items, 3 cases where there would be a difference between Rabbah and Rava. So now we say, actually, there's only 2 cases where there would be a difference between them. Ela my benayu ikebenayu de'achu betre. If 2 people bring the document from overseas, then those 2 people, according to Rava, they do not need to say befanai nichtav because those 2 people themselves can act as witnesses if they ever need to ratify it in the future. So they can act as witnesses. And therefore, they don't need to say it. Whereas, if it's about the fact that it was written lishma, so then they still have to say, "Oh, we're not just messengers. We were actually present when it was written, and we saw that it was written lishma." So, according to Rabbah, they would still have to say the formula, even though there's 2 people, so that they can testify it was written lishma and say it was written in front of me, since it was written in front of us. Therefore, it doesn't matter if there's 1 person or 2 messengers or 100 messengers. Someone has to say, "I know that it was written lishma." According to Rabbah, who has that reason only, and that reason does not apply because you have 2 people that can ratify the signatures, so they don't need to say the formula. Or if someone is taking the get from one area to another area within the same country that is overseas. So since it's in the same country, the witnesses will be easy to find if you ever need to ratify it in the future. So therefore, according to the reason of finding witnesses, there's no problem, and so therefore the messenger would not have to say it. So according to Rava, that's the only reason, and therefore it does not have to say it. According to Rabbah, he says, listen, I agree with your reason, but I add another reason why you would need to say it, and that reason does apply in this case because it was written outside the land of Israel, where people are not familiar with Lishma, even though it was taken close by within the same country, you still need to say the formula to certify that it was written Lishma. Okay, once we know this, that in fact everybody agrees, Rabbah and Rava agree with the reason of finding witnesses, that we could go back and review the various questions we had against the Rabbah, and we can revise the answers and give actually probably simpler answers to that. But we wanted to go through the exercise to see if we can explain the entire Mishnah only according to one reason, only according to another reason, even though the simple, basic reason that everyone agrees to is, in fact, the need to have witnesses that can ratify it. And all this is really to protect the woman in the future, that if someone should come and question these signatures, we want to make sure that there will be no trouble later for the woman, for her marriage, for those children. And then therefore, we require it to be pre-certified, even if those witnesses cannot, even if no one can be found to certify the witnesses, we say, oh, it was already pre-certified, so that will prevent any problems in the future. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.